Every room you walk into has an invisible temperature. Some people raise it without saying a word, some people lower it just by staying calm. And most people never realize they're doing either one. This is the world of emotional intelligence, not the version people talk about at work. The polished version about being a good listener or staying positive. The real version is stranger, older, and far more powerful. It's a set of laws that quietly decide who gets manipulated, who gets trusted, who gets promoted, and who keeps their peace, no matter what's happening around them. Most people go their entire lives reacting to emotions rather than understanding them. They feel something, they act on it, and they rarely stop to ask where that feeling actually came from, or whether the response it produced actually served them. This isn't a character flaw, it's simply what happens when nobody ever teaches the mechanics underneath feeling itself. School teaches how to solve equations and memorize dates, but almost never how to recognize the gap between a feeling and a reaction, or how to tell whether an emotion in a room actually belongs to you. Once you understand these laws, you can't unsee them. You'll start noticing them in every conversation, every conflict, every silence. You'll notice which people set the tone of a room and which ones simply absorb it. You'll notice the half-second gap before someone chooses their words carefully instead of firing back instantly. And slowly, you'll notice these same patterns in yourself, the ones that have been running quietly in the background for years. What makes these laws especially worth understanding is that none of them require you to become a different person. They're not about acquiring a new personality or suppressing the parts of yourself that feel most natural. They're about noticing mechanics that were always running beneath the surface, whether you were aware of them or not, and choosing to work with them instead of being quietly steered by them. A person who understands these laws doesn't become less emotional. If anything, they often become more comfortable with emotion, precisely because they've stopped being afraid of what it might do if left unexamined. By the end of this, you'll have a working map of 8 distinct laws, each building on the one before it. Some will feel immediately familiar, patterns you've sensed in yourself for years without having language for them. Others might surprise you, revealing habits so automatic you never thought to question them. Either way, the goal is the same, not perfection, but awareness. Because awareness is where every one of these laws actually begins to change anything at all. Let's begin. Law 1. The law of emotional leakage here is the first thing almost nobody tells you about emotions. The ones you refuse to feel don't disappear. They leak. You can suppress anger in a meeting, but it comes out in the sharp edge of your next email. You can hide disappointment from a friend, but it shows up in how quickly you change the subject. Emotional leakage is what happens when a feeling is denied a direct exit, so it finds an indirect one instead through tone, through body language, through the small decisions you make without noticing you're making them. This law exists because emotions are, at their core, energy that demands expression. When you block the front door, it climbs out the window. Think about the last time someone snapped at you over something small. 9 times out of 10, the snap wasn't really about the small thing. It was about pressure that had been building somewhere else, finally finding a crack to escape through. Emotional leakage shows up in patterns you can learn to recognize. There's the delayed explosion, calm for days, then furious over something minor. There's the passive signal sighing, going quiet, answering in short sentences instead of saying what's actually wrong. There's the physical leak tension, headaches, clenched jaws, a stomach that won't settle, all standing in for words that were never spoken. And there's the projected leak, where an emotion you won't admit to feeling gets assigned to someone else. Instead, you accuse a partner of being distant, when really it's you who has withdrawn. Consider a common scenario. Someone has a difficult conversation with their manager, one where real frustration builds but is never voiced, because voicing it feels risky. That evening, at home, the smallest inconvenience, a delayed dinner, a minor comment from a partner, triggers a reaction wildly out of proportion to what actually happened. The partner is confused, maybe even hurt, having no idea the reaction had almost nothing to do with them. This is emotional leakage in its purest form, unprocessed feeling from one context finding release in a completely unrelated one at the cost of a relationship that had nothing to do with the original problem. Left unmanaged, emotional leakage quietly damages relationships. People sense the mismatch between what you're saying and what you're actually giving off, even if they can't name it. That mismatch breeds distrust faster than an honest, difficult conversation ever would. Over time, people around a chronic leaker learn to walk carefully, sensing unpredictability even when nothing is technically wrong, because the felt experience of being around leaked emotion is unsettling regardless of its actual target. The way out is not to stop feeling, it's to stop denying. Naming an emotion the moment you notice it, even privately, taking the edge off before it demands to leak somewhere. A simple habit works surprisingly well. Pause and ask yourself, what am I actually feeling right now underneath the thing I'm about to say? Say it, even if only in your own head. The moment of feeling is acknowledged, it needs far less room to escape sideways. There's also a practical structural habit worth building, a short daily check-in, even just 2 or 3 minutes, where you ask what emotional residue from the day hasn't been addressed yet. This doesn't require journaling for hours or dramatic self-analysis. It requires consistency. A feeling named once, briefly, loses much of the pressure that would otherwise force it out somewhere less convenient. There's a common mistake people make once they first learn about emotional leakage. They try to eliminate it entirely by forcing themselves to feel calm, rather than actually processing what's underneath. This almost never works, because forced calm is just another form of suppression wearing a friendlier mask. The goal isn't to stop feeling frustration, sadness, or anger. It's to give those feelings a legitimate outlet before they find an illegitimate one. A 5-minute conversation with a trusted friend, a page of unfiltered writing that no one else will read. Even a few minutes of physical movement to burn off the charge. These aren't indulgent detours from productivity, they're maintenance, the same way a car needs its oil changed regularly to avoid a much larger and more expensive problem later. Emotional leakage teaches us something uncomfortable but useful. What you don't process, you'll eventually perform. And that brings us to the second law, because the leakage doesn't just come from within you. It also spreads outward into every room you enter. It's also worth mentioning that emotional leakage often escalates in cycles if left completely unaddressed. One unprocessed feeling leaks into a small conflict. That conflict creates a new layer of tension, and that new tension becomes the next thing left unprocessed, compounding over weeks or months into a general sense of friction that seems to have no clear source. People in this state often describe feeling on edge without being able to point to why. The why is usually a backlog of small, unprocessed leaks that were never traced back to their origin. Breaking this cycle doesn't require resolving everything at once. It requires interrupting the compounding by processing feelings closer to when they actually happen, rather than letting them stack indefinitely. One more distinction worth making is between processing a feeling and dwelling on it. Processing has a natural endpoint. The feeling is named, understood, and released. Dwelling has no endpoint. It loops the same content repeatedly without resolution, which can feel like processing while actually functioning more like another form of leakage, just an internal one instead of an outward one. A helpful marker is time-boxing reflection deliberately a few focused minutes rather than an open-ended spiral, so the goal remains resolution rather than rumination. Law 2, the law of the mirror. People are far more reflective than they realize. Walk into a room tense and rushed, and within minutes the room tenses with you. Walk in calm and unhurried, and something in the air shifts to match. This is the law of the mirror. Before you say a single word, you have already set the emotional tone of the space you're in. This isn't mysticism. It's biology. Human nervous systems are wired to read and mimic the emotional states of the people around them, a mechanism that likely evolved to keep groups synchronized for survival. A tense face triggers tension in the people watching it. A relaxed voice invites relaxation in return. We are, whether we like it or not, contagious. The mirror law explains why certain people seem to have a magnetic calm about them, not because nothing bothers them, but because they've learned to regulate their own state before entering a shared one. It also explains why a single anxious person in a meeting can make an entire team feel uneasy, even if nobody can point to a specific reason why. Picture two versions of the same scenario. A team leader walks into a tense planning meeting already frustrated from an earlier call. Without saying anything about that earlier call, their clipped tone, quick movements, and short answers seep into the room, and within 10 minutes, the whole team is speaking faster, interrupting more, agreeing less. Now picture the same leader, same tense situation, but arriving having taken 60 seconds beforehand to settle their breathing and reset their posture. The meeting's content is identical, but the emotional undercurrent is completely different, and so, often, is the outcome. Better ideas surface when the room isn't quietly bracing itself. The danger of ignoring this law is that you become emotionally reactive to your environment instead of an influence on it. You walk into a stressful house and absorb the stress. You sit across from an irritable colleague and become irritable yourself without ever choosing to. Left unchecked, you spend your emotional life responding to whatever mood happens to be strongest in the room, rather than setting your own. This is exhausting in a way that's hard to name, because it feels like the day itself was difficult, when really it was your own unregulated murmuring that made it feel that way. The strategy here is deceptively simple. Regulate before you enter. Take the extra 10 seconds before a difficult conversation to settle your own breathing, your own posture, your own internal state. Not to fake calm, but to actually generate it, because a performed calm is usually seen through instantly. A genuine one is felt and mirrored back. Over time, this becomes less of a technique and more of a presence. People start to notice that things feel steadier when you're around, even if they can't say exactly why. This regulation compounds over repeated interactions with the same people. A household where one person consistently enters calm, even during stressful periods, gradually shifts the household's baseline emotional temperature, not because conflict disappears, but because there's a steady anchor pulling the system back toward equilibrium after each disruption, rather than amplifying it further. A subtle mistake people make with this law is assuming regulation means suppressing outward energy, entirely becoming flat, muted, artificially neutral. That's not regulation, it's a different kind of leakage, and people usually sense the flatness as coldness rather than calm. Genuine regulation isn't about dampening your presence. It's about choosing which internal state you bring into a room deliberately, rather than carrying in whatever state happened to arrive with you from the previous hour. A person can be warm, engaged, and fully present, while still being the steadiest one in the room. The two aren't in conflict, and confusing them is what makes some people avoid practicing this law altogether. Mistakenly believing composure requires becoming less themselves. Understanding the mirror law also protects you from a common trap, blaming a room's mood entirely on the people in it, without noticing what you brought into it first. And this leads directly into the next law, because setting your emotional tone requires something most people skip entirely: a pause between what you feel and what you do about it. There's an interesting asymmetry worth noting in how the mirror law operates across different relationships. In close, familiar relationships, a long partnership, a close family, the mirroring effect is often stronger, because the nervous systems involved have years of shared history calibrating to each other's signals. This means small shifts in tone from a long-term partner can have an outsized effect on the household's mood compared to the same shift from a stranger. This isn't a flaw in the relationship, it's simply the mirror law operating at a deeper, more practiced level, which makes conscious regulation even more valuable in the relationships that matter most, precisely because the stakes and the sensitivity are both higher. This is also why repairing a strained relationship often benefits from small, consistent moments of regulated presence rather than one large gesture. A single calm conversation rarely undoes months of accumulated tension, but a steady pattern of arriving calm, day after day, slowly recalibrates what the relationship has come to expect as its baseline. The same gradual process that allowed tension to build in the first place, now working in reverse. Law 3. The law of delayed reaction there is a tiny gap between the moment something happens and the moment you respond to it. Most people don't know this gap exists because they've never trained themselves to notice it. But that gap, however small, is where almost all emotional power actually lives. Someone insults you. In the space of half a second before your mouth opens, you have a choice: react instantly or let a beat pass. Most conflicts, most regretted messages, most damaged relationships trace back to a moment where that gap was skipped entirely. Reaction fired without a single second of delay. This law matters because emotions are fast, but not always accurate. The first surge of anger or hurt is real, but it's rarely the whole truth of a situation. It's a raw, unfiltered alarm bell. Given even a few seconds, the mind usually adds context. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. Maybe there's something else going on. Maybe this isn't worth the fight. Skip the delay and you respond to the alarm bell instead of the actual situation. Consider the difference between two responses to the exact same provocative text message. In the first version, a reply is fired back within seconds, sharp and defensive, escalating a minor misunderstanding into a real argument that takes days to repair. In the second version, the message sits unanswered for 20 minutes, while the initial spike of irritation passes, and the eventual reply is calm enough to ask a clarifying question instead of assuming the worst. Same trigger, same person, completely different outcome, and the only variable that changed was the length of the gap between stimulus and response. People without this skill are easy to predict, and easier still to provoke, say, the right trigger word, and the reaction is guaranteed, instant, and often disproportionate. People who've built the delay become far harder to read and far harder to manipulate, because their response isn't automatic, it's chosen. This matters enormously in negotiation, in conflict, and in any situation where someone might be deliberately trying to provoke a reaction. The delay itself becomes a form of protection, denying the provocation its intended effect. Building this gap starts small. A single breath before replying to a heated message. Counting to 3 before speaking in an argument. Physically leaving the room for 60 seconds when a reaction feels too hot to trust. None of this suppresses the emotion. It simply creates enough space for judgment to catch up to feeling. A useful structural habit is the 24-hour rule for anything written that carries real weight: a resignation email, a confrontational message, a public response to criticism. Drafting it immediately, when the emotion is freshest, but waiting a full day before sending almost always changes the final version, often significantly softening or reframing what felt urgent and necessary in the heat of the moment. It's worth being clear about what this law doesn't mean. Delayed reaction isn't the same as avoidance some people use, taking space as a permanent excuse to never address a conflict at all, letting the delay stretch into weeks of silence rather than the intended few minutes or hours. The law works because the gap is brief and purposeful, giving judgment time to catch up to feeling, not because the topic is being quietly buried indefinitely. A useful test is whether the delay is being used to think more clearly or simply to avoid an uncomfortable conversation altogether. The first strengthens a relationship, the second slowly erodes it in a different way. Over time, this delay becomes your signature. People notice that you don't explode, that you don't fire off the regrettable text, that you seem to think before you speak even under pressure. That reputation, once earned, becomes one of the most valuable forms of quiet authority a person can have. But delay alone isn't enough if you're constantly absorbing emotions that were never yours to carry in the first place, which brings us to the next law. This law also has a physical dimension worth understanding. The initial surge of a strong emotion is accompanied by a real physiological state: elevated heart rate, a rush of stress hormones, narrowed attention, and this state takes time to settle even after the triggering thought has passed. This is part of why the delay works better as a genuine pause than as a purely mental exercise. Physical actions that calm the nervous system directly: slow, deliberate breathing, a short walk, splashing cold water on the face, often accelerate the gap's usefulness far more than simply trying to think your way to calm, while the body is still flooded with the original physiological response. It's also worth noting that the appropriate length of this delay isn't fixed; it scales with the intensity of the trigger. A minor irritation might only need a few seconds. A genuinely hurtful comment might need an hour or a full night's sleep before a fair response is possible. Learning to gauge which situation calls for which length of delay is itself a skill, one that develops with practice and honest self-observation over time. Law 4. The law of borrowed moods. Not every emotion you feel in a day actually originates with you. Some of it is borrowed, picked up from a tense phone call, a stressed coworker, a family member's bad mood, and carried around for hours as if it were your own. Without clear boundaries, your nervous system doesn't distinguish well between this is happening to me and this is happening near me. A friend vents about their terrible day, and somehow you leave the conversation feeling drained, even though nothing actually happened to you. Left unchecked, this law quietly exhausts people who are naturally sensitive to others' emotional states. They walk through life absorbing everyone's stress, everyone's frustration, everyone's sadness, and wonder why they feel emotionally depleted despite nothing bad happening in their own lives. This is often mistaken for having a fragile temperament, when really it's a boundary problem, not a personality flaw. Think of someone who starts their morning in a genuinely good mood, only to take a phone call from a relative in crisis, spend 20 minutes fully absorbed in that relative's distress, and then carry a heavy, anxious feeling for the rest of the day, even though the crisis itself has nothing to do with their own life and nothing about their own day has actually changed. The mood was borrowed in full, and without a conscious effort to set it back down, it simply gets carried indefinitely, quietly coloring every subsequent interaction. The fix isn't to become cold or detached from others, it's calibration. Learning to ask, quietly and quickly, is this feeling mine, or did I just pick it up? A short mental check after an intense conversation. What did I feel before this interaction, and has that shifted? And if so, whose emotion is actually driving that shift? Practical boundaries help too. A short pause between an emotionally heavy conversation and whatever comes next, rather than carrying one directly into the other. A walk, a few minutes of silence, even just naming internally that was their storm, not mine, can be enough to set the borrowed mood down instead of carrying it for the rest of the day. People who struggle most with borrowed moods often share one trait, a strong, genuine sensitivity to others, which is actually a valuable quality, not a flaw to be trained away. The goal of this law was never to become less sensitive. It's to add a filtering step between noticing someone else's emotion and adopting it as your own. Sensitivity without a filter becomes exhausting. Sensitivity with a filter becomes a genuine strength, allowing real connection with others' experiences without losing your own footing in the process. Law 5. The law of selective empathy. Empathy is often treated as something you either have or don't, as if more is always better. But unlimited, uncalibrated empathy is not a virtue. It's a slow leak of your own energy, boundaries, and clarity. Mastery isn't about maximizing how much you feel for others. It's about calibrating how much you absorb. And when. Over-empathize with everyone, and you burn out, lose your own perspective in every conflict, and become an easy target for people who know exactly how to use your compassion against you. Under-empathize, and you isolate yourself, missing the emotional cues that build real connection. The people who navigate relationships most skillfully aren't the ones who feel the most. They're the ones who've learned to direct their empathy deliberately towards situations and people where it actually matters, while staying protected in situations designed to exploit it. This shows up constantly in daily life. Someone consistently overshares hardship right before asking for something. The empathetic response is triggered specifically to lower your guard. Recognizing the pattern doesn't mean becoming suspicious of everyone's pain. It means noticing when empathy is being used as a lever rather than shared as a connection. Imagine a colleague who every time a deadline approaches mentions a personal difficulty just before asking to be excused from their share of the work. The difficulty may well be real, but the pattern, hardship consistently surfacing right before a specific request, is worth noticing separately from the hardship itself. Selective empathy allows compassion for the difficulty while still holding a boundary around the request, rather than the two automatically being merged into an obligation. Selective empathy is built through a simple internal filter. Is this person sharing to connect or to extract something? Is my emotional response here actually helping them or just draining me without changing anything? These aren't cynical questions. They're protective ones, and they allow you to stay generous with your empathy in the relationships that deserve it. Genuine empathy can hold space for someone's difficulty without needing to immediately fix it, solve it, or take on responsibility for it. Many people confuse empathy with rescue, believing that true empathy requires stepping in and absorbing the problem itself, rather than simply witnessing it and offering support where appropriate. This confusion is often what leads to burnout in caring, generous people. Not the empathy itself, but the unexamined assumption that empathy obligates rescue. Law 6. The law of the unspoken need, almost no conflict, is actually about what it appears to be about. A fight about dishes is rarely about dishes. An argument about being 5 minutes late is rarely about the 5 minutes. Beneath nearly every surface complaint sits an unspoken emotional need that the person either doesn't know how to name or feels too vulnerable to say directly. This law explains why so many arguments go in circles without resolution, because both people are debating the surface issue while the real issue, the actual need, never gets addressed. Someone complaining about being interrupted in conversation may really be expressing a need to feel respected. Someone upset about a cancelled plan may really be expressing a fear of not mattering enough to someone else's priorities. This law rewards a specific kind of listening for the need underneath the words, not just the words themselves. When someone raises their voice about something small, the more useful question isn't why are they overreacting? It's what need is this protecting? Take a common household argument. One partner upset that dishes were left in the sink overnight. Argued at the surface level, this becomes a debate about chores, fairness, and effort, one that rarely resolves cleanly because both sides have reasonable points. Argued at the level of the unspoken need, it often reveals something different entirely, a need to feel like an equal partner rather than a default caretaker, a need that has very little to do with the dishes themselves and everything to do with feeling seen in the relationship's daily rhythm. In practice, this means responding to the underlying feeling as much as the literal complaint. Instead of defending against the accusation, naming the need directly. It sounds like you didn't feel like a priority right then. Often de-escalates a conflict faster than any logical argument about who was technically right. Addressing only the surface, while ignoring the need underneath, tends to produce a relationship where the same argument resurfaces again and again in slightly different clothing, because the actual issue was never touched. Addressing both the practical matter and the emotional need beneath it is what actually resolves a conflict instead of merely pausing it until the next trigger arrives. This skill transforms relationships because it signals something rare, that you're not just hearing the complaint, you're hearing the person. And that quality of attention builds trust faster than almost anything else. Law 7. The law of self-narration, the emotion itself, is rarely the whole story. The story you tell yourself about that emotion often has more power over you than the feeling did in the first place. Two people can feel the exact same nervous energy before a big presentation. One narrates it as, "I'm anxious, something's wrong, I should avoid this." The other narrates it as, "I'm activated, this matters to me, I'm ready." Same physical sensation. Completely different emotional experience, because the narration shaped the meaning. This law explains why some people seem able to move through difficulty with more resilience than others who face far less. It's rarely that they feel less. It's that the internal story attached to the feeling is different. This is temporary instead of this will never end. I'm learning instead of I'm failing. Left unexamined, self-narration runs on autopilot, often inherited from childhood patterns or repeated so often it feels like objective fact rather than interpretation. Someone who was told growing up that showing emotion was weakness may narrate every wave of sadness as a personal failure, compounding the original feeling with shame on top of it. Consider someone who receives critical feedback at work. The raw feeling that arrives first, a sting, a tightening in the chest, is nearly universal. What happens next diverges sharply based on narration. One internal story says this confirms I'm not good enough, and the sting deepens into a spiral that colors the rest of the day. A different internal story, applied to the exact same feedback, says this is uncomfortable but useful information, and the same initial sting fades within minutes, replaced by practical problem solving instead of shame. Changing this law in practice starts with catching the narration in real time. When a strong emotion appears, notice not just the feeling, but the sentence your mind is automatically attaching to it. Is the sentence actually true, or is it just familiar? Could a more accurate, less catastrophic sentence fit the same feeling just as well? One helpful practice is keeping a short list of common narrations you tend to default to under stress. Phrases like, "I always mess this up," or "nobody actually wants me here." Written down and looked at plainly, outside the heat of the moment, these sentences often reveal themselves as old, worn patterns rather than accurate assessments of the present situation. This isn't about forcing positivity onto real pain, it's about separating the raw signal from the interpretation layered on top of it, so the feeling can be felt honestly without being amplified by an old, inherited story that was never actually true. Law 8. The law of composure as currency in any high-stakes moment, a negotiation, a crisis, a difficult conversation. There's usually one person in the room who stays visibly steady while everyone else is reactive. That person, almost without trying, becomes the one others quietly trust the most. Composure isn't the absence of feeling. It's the visible evidence that a person can hold difficulty without being controlled by it. And in moments of pressure, that visible steadiness becomes more valuable than almost any argument, credential, or title in the room. This law operates because uncertainty makes people search for a stable reference point. When everything feels unpredictable, the calmest person present becomes the de facto anchor, whether or not they intended to take that role. Composure signals competence even when nothing has actually been proven yet. Picture a workplace crisis, a major deadline missed, a client upset, the team scrambling. In that room, the person who stays visibly steady, asking calm, practical questions instead of joining the panic, tends to become the person others instinctively look to next, regardless of formal title. Not because they necessarily have the best solution yet, but because their steadiness creates enough psychological space for a good solution to actually emerge, rather than the room simply amplifying its own panic. The danger of ignoring this law is assuming composure will come naturally when it matters most. It rarely does. Without practice, pressure reveals whatever patterns were already there. This is why the earlier laws matter so much. The delayed reaction, the regulated entrance, the accurate self-narration, all of it builds the foundation composure is made of. Composure under real pressure isn't a personality trait. It's the compound result of everything practiced beforehand. It also helps to separate composure from detachment. A composed person in a crisis isn't unaffected by it. They may feel the weight of it just as strongly as anyone else in the room. The difference is that the feeling doesn't hijack their behavior. Real composure keeps the feeling present while keeping the response deliberate. The goal was never to feel less, only to be governed less by what's felt in any given moment. Building this currency deliberately means treating small moments of friction as practice for larger ones. Staying steady in a minor disagreement builds the same muscle needed for a major one. And over time, this reputation compounds. People begin to bring you their hardest moments, not because you have all the answers, but because your presence itself makes hard moments feel survivable. Each time a person stays steady through a difficult moment, it becomes slightly easier to stay steady the next time, because there's now direct personal evidence that pressure can be survived without falling apart. 8 laws, one thread running through all of them. Emotional intelligence was never about suppressing feeling, and it was never about performing positivity. It's about understanding the mechanics underneath your own reactions well enough to choose rather than react. The leakage you stop denying. The mood you stop absorbing by accident. The gap you build before responding. The story you tell yourself, examined instead of inherited. None of these laws ask you to feel less. They ask you to understand more. Because the moment you understand the mechanics, you stop being run by them, and you start running them instead. None of these 8 laws work in isolation. They build on each other, forming a kind of internal architecture. The delay you build in Law 3 gives you the space to notice the leakage in Law 1 before it escapes sideways. The regulated presence in Law 2 becomes far easier to sustain once you've stopped absorbing borrowed moods in Law 4. And composure, the final law, is really just the visible result of the other 7 working quietly together underneath the surface. If there's one law worth carrying forward above the rest, it's the third, the delayed reaction. Nearly every other law becomes easier to apply once that small gap between feeling and response is firmly in place. Because that gap is where the choice to leak less, mirror less unconsciously, borrow less, empathize more selectively, listen for the real need, narrate more accurately, and stay composed, all actually happens. Everything else in this video is, in some sense, what fills that gap once it exists.